Yeah, thank you for joining us. It's long overdue. I've been wanting to have a one-on-one session with you to talk about a couple of things.
Yeah, I'm glad it's happening eventually. Yeah.
Welcome to everyone. This is State of the Art with Thami Mbongo. Today we are having our guest, Oprah Mike van Graan. I don't think Oprah Mike needs the introduction, but just for those who don't know, he graduated from University of Cape Town with BA honors degree in drama and was appointed as an associate producer at UCT Drama Department from 2015 to 2019. He has served in various leadership positions from anti-apartheid cultural organization, including being the director of community arts project officer for the Congress of South African Writers, and general secretary of the National Arts Coalition. There are so many things, but as we are going to unpack Oprah Mike in terms of bio, you understand, we will cover quite a lot of other things. Once again, thank you very much, Oprah Mike. Oprah Mike, I've been wanting to ask you a couple of questions. So today, let's unpack these things. First of all, Oprah Mike, you serve under Minister Ben Ngubane, who was the first Minister of Arts and Culture. So can you tell us how was it working with him, and what was the timing of the government at that time, because you were the special advisor to him? Can you, so that I want us to understand what went wrong over the years? Was there any plan from the government? So maybe you can start by sharing us your experience of serving under Dr. Ben Ngubane.
Cool. Well, thanks very much, Thami, for the chance to have this one-on-one. I'm looking forward to it. So maybe just to provide some context, when the ANC and a whole bunch of other organizations were unbanned in 1989, and Nelson Mandela and a whole bunch of political prisoners were released, and the CODESA negotiations began to happen, there were those of us in the arts and culture space who said, look, unless we organize ourselves as the arts and culture sector, it's likely that we'll be left off the negotiating agenda, because the parties would consider that there are much more important things to deal with as legacies of apartheid. So in the mid-80s, there were a bunch of organizations that came into being, largely because of the states of emergency that had been declared in the mid-80s. And so normal political activities in anti-apartheid struggle were banned. And in that context, organizations began to emerge that used culture as a shield behind which political activity began to happen. So in that context, you had organizations like the Congress of South African Writers, the Association of Community Arts Centers, the Performing Arts Workers Equity, Film and Allied Workers Organization, and so on, coming into being, so that by the time 1989 happened, these organizations came together and we launched what was called the National Arts Initiative, which was a one-year-long program. We launched it in 1991. And we said that this organization will basically be a coming together of organizations to make sure that we will be able to have policy recommendations for a post-apartheid dispensation. And I was kind of the general secretary of the National Arts Initiative at that point. And someone like Graan, who's unfortunately just passed away last week, he was very much part of that initiative as well. That led to the emergence of something called the National Arts Coalition, where at the end of 1993, we had, for the first time in the history of the country, a national coalition of organizations that came together on the basis simply of being engaged in the arts and wanting to have a new understanding of what a post-apartheid dispensation for the arts should look like. And again, I was elected as the General Secretary of the Arts Coalition. So by the time the 1994 elections happened, 6 months after the launch of the Arts Coalition, or 4 months after the launch of the Arts Coalition, each minister who was appointed, and can I just say that what happened at that time, with the elections, they had this government of national unity so that any political party that scored 10% or more of the vote would be entitled to a seat in national government, in the cabinet. And the ANC won most of the vote, as we know. The National Party won the second most vote, and then the IFP won the third most vote. And the distribution of cabinet posts within the ANC got most, the National Party got 6, the IFP got 3. And of course, the ANC kept most of the most important ones for themselves, and they allocated what they considered some of the lesser portfolios to the other junior partners in government and national unity. And because basically they inherited a civil service from the past, from the apartheid era, it was decided that each cabinet minister could appoint 2 advisors to help them to set up a new department, but also to set up new policies in their particular areas. The first minister appointed to head up arts and culture then was Dr. Ngubane, who also has passed away recently. And his deputy was Winnie Mandela. And in the cabinet with each minister, because the first portfolio on arts and culture included 2 legs, science and technology and arts and culture, the cabinet minister, Ngubane, could then appoint 4 advisors. And I had no idea who Ngubane was. I basically got a phone call from him to say, we'd like to invite you to serve as an advisor. And it was largely because of the profile that the Arts Coalition had developed, and my profile as, I suppose, at that time, the General Secretary of the Arts Coalition. So with all of the noise that we were making in the media around arts and culture and it's having to be taken seriously in a new dispensation at that time, and because we had taken a very strong line as the Arts Coalition to be politically non-partisan, although we were all political activists, mainly we took a position that we would be non-partisan, that we would not be aligned to any political party. That, I suppose, held us in good stead to be able to play an influential role in post-apartheid dispensation, where politicians appointed then didn't feel like the Arts Coalition was siding with one or other political entity. So when I got this invitation to serve as an advisor along with Roger Jardine, who was the ANC's, he was part of the ANC at that point, looking at the science and technology portfolio, and he eventually became the first Director General of the department. So Lawrence Schlemmer was a political scientist, and another person who was a nuclear physicist was also appointed as an advisor. So we were appointed these advisors to help to bring about new policies within the Ministry of Arts, Culture, Science and Technology. When I was invited by Ngubane to serve as his advisor, I went to the steering committee of the National Arts Coalition and said, look, I've been invited to play this role of advisor. It's the IFP. It's a party that none of us supports or believes in or has ever thought that we will work with or whatever. We're a non-partisan entity. How do you advise me to operate? And the National Steering Committee basically said, look, the reason why we came into being was to influence government, to make sure that our policy proposals as a non-partisan entity would be taken seriously by government. So if you are being invited by the minister to come and advise him about policy, you absolutely have to be there. But obviously you are still part of the National Arts Coalition, so you're still part of civil society, you're still the General Secretary of the National Arts Coalition, and we can have this kind of two-way relationship between you playing this role of advisor. At the same time, we are civil society having influence within the kind of senior political entity at that point. And so that's how it kind of came about. And through that, when the minister then began to talk about, well, how shall we go about formulating policy? I'd said, look, we are one entity, the National Arts Coalition. There are other formations that exist within the arts and culture space. And we don't, if we are serious about being a democracy, we can't simply have one organization influencing you or being seen to influence you. The ANC had a cultural desk as well. Other parties had cultural components. So we said, look, the best way to do this is to set up an independent arts and culture task group. So we invited the public and the arts and culture sector to make nominations for an arts and culture task group whose role was to basically solicit proposals for a new dispensation for arts and culture. And out of that process, 23 people were appointed by the minister to be the first arts and culture task group. So people like Andries Olifant was the elected chairperson, Sibongile Kumbalo, she was the deputy chairperson. Someone is now heading up the IEC. He was part of the ACTAG process at that point. At that time, he basically worked for the Playhouse Company in KwaZulu-Natal. So, there were 23 people who over 8 months went throughout the country, took on written and verbal proposals about a new dispensation. And out of that came the ACTAG report. And out of the ACTAG report came the first white paper on arts and culture. So very long answer to your question, but that really was the process and how it came about at that time, Thami.
No, it's very helpful. It's what we call mukhabul. We need to know. I'm sure there are many young people like myself who never knew Winnie Mandela was the deputy, minister in this post. So for Wenapla, Mike, where do you think things started to go wrong with the department and the government from that vision of making sure that you work with different structures? And for your take, where did things started to fall apart?
Thami, I think that's a very good question. So first of all, you need to understand that what happened with the drafting of the white paper. So at that time, when I was first appointed as an advisor, there was no department really. It was a Department of Education and Culture that had been inherited from the past. And then Roger Jardine was appointed as the first Director General, and his role was to set up a new department, right? Including both science and technology, but also arts and culture. By the time the white paper on arts and culture was adopted by Cabinet, and this was in August of 1996, at that time, local government elections were happening as well. And the IFP lost really badly in KwaZulu-Natal. And as a consequence, the IFP then took a decision that they will replace the Premier of KwaZulu-Natal with Benin Gubani, who was at that time the Minister of Arts and Culture. So soon after the adoption of the white paper, Benin Gubani became the Premier of KwaZulu-Natal, and Laila Limchali became the Minister of Arts and Culture. And I was still in the position of advisor at that point. So by virtue of having a contract as an advisor, I continued to play the role of advisor to Laila Limchali. Again, someone I had no idea who he was in terms of I knew of his politics, but not him as a person. But I basically said, look, I'll continue to play this role until such time that a National Arts Council is appointed. So one of the first things to come out of the new white paper on arts and culture was legislation around the National Arts Council. And in fact, I was party to drafting the first National Arts Council Act. And then once that act was adopted, there was this call for nominations for people to be appointed to the Arts Council. And Laila Limchali, as the minister, was responsible for appointing the first Arts Council. But again, by virtue of being an IFP minister from KwaZulu-Natal, he didn't know the sector. So I was sent along as his advisor to listen to all of the interviews that were happening. And at that time, the panel who were doing the interviews as required by the Act comprised Constitutional Court Judge L.B. Sachs, Njabulo Ndebele, Marius Vickers, and so on, some really high-profile people who did these interviews publicly, made a shortlist out of the people who have been interviewed and submitted that shortlist to the minister, out of whom he then appointed the first members of the Arts Council. And obviously, by virtue of being an advisor and knowing the arts and culture sector, I was able to provide some advice in that regard. But although he then asked that I stuck around, and continued to serve as an advisor, I decided that my work was done. And I then retreated back into civil society and began to write and produced a publication called The Cultural Weapon, in which I was monitoring the implementation of policy, because policy was very visionary because it came from artists through the ACTAG process into the white paper, which arts people were partly responsible for drafting as well. So fantastic policy at that time, but been very poorly implemented by a new department responsible for arts and culture. I then decided to retreat back into civil society and to play a role of monitoring the implementation of policy. So you asked about what went wrong. I think there were a couple of things that went wrong. The first is that into the department, people were appointed to be responsible for arts and culture, and they came from the arts and culture kind of civil society sector. But it would seem as if their primary commitment was to their peers in government rather than to the arts and culture sector. So they began to look much more at how do we play these roles within, this new government and show that we can, as arts and culture department, maintain a degree of I don't know what, but their commitment to the arts and culture sector and their commitment to engaging in consultation and working with the arts and culture sector began to fade. So a real sense of the arts and culture sector taking responsibility for their lives through the ACTAG process, that began to dissipate. And those appointed to government now began to say, you know what, we are now government, so we are going to govern. We don't need to engage with the arts and culture sector because we've been elected, even though the officials were not elected, they were appointed by politicians who might have been elected. So that was like one of the first things that broke down. The second thing that broke down was that an organization like the National Arts Coalition disbanded for a couple of reasons. The first was that the Constitution gave responsibility for arts and culture policy implementation to provinces. And so with this concurrent powers going to provinces, many people in the arts believed that the first port of call for funding for the arts was at a provincial level. There was no longer a need for a national arts kind of civil society structure. So we disbanded the Arts Coalition, believing that our policies were in place. Some of our comrades were in power. They would implement the policies that we were partly responsible for, and that we would then begin to develop art structures at a provincial level, because provincial arts councils were coming into place as well. And so that's where we would begin to focus our civil society attention. And I think that what we've learned as a consequence is that the formulation of policy is only the beginning. It's not the end. At that time, we thought once our policies are in place, we can then retire to the garret and go and create art. And that's not the case, because we've seen how that you can have fantastic policy, but if you have incredibly poor implementation of policy, a lack of vision on the part of people, a lack of skill on the part of people implementing policy, and then you land up with fantastic policy, but incredibly poor implementation. And I think that that is basically what has happened in the department.
Yeah, I'm also glad, Mike, you are also speaking about the 1996 white paper. Like I was saying to some of my friends, it's so amazing that a lot of young people are not interested in policies because most of them feel good. You guys are using big words, you understand, to unpack. And apparently the white paper was endorsed. But how do you think, because even now the implementation is not yet clear of what is happening. What would the implementation of this revised white paper mean?
You know, Thami, I think that one of the big mistakes that we make as people in the arts is that we give responsibility for policy to people who are not from the arts, both for its formulation and its implementation. So a few years later, we wake up and we think, wow, why are we in this crisis? It's because we are not present when policy is being formulated, and we don't have the structures for government to liaise with in terms of implementation of policy. So, and I think that that's been one of the key responsibilities that we need to face up to as arts and culture practitioners. Why I got involved in arts and culture policy was because, as you mentioned in the introduction, in the mid-80s, I was part of running the Community Arts Project in Cape Town. And the Community Arts Project came into being after 1976 and what was happening in Soweto, and it became a place that provided access to skills in the arts for many people from historically disadvantaged communities. At that time, people were able to acquire skills in the arts if they went to university. Many people did not have the academic qualifications to access university. They didn't have the resources. And because of apartheid, many of these universities where they were training people in the arts were not open or not encouraging Black people to come and study there. So the Community Arts Project became this place where people who had fantastic talent but did not necessarily have the skills and the resources to acquire training in the arts, they could come and acquire training there. So I kind of ran that for a few years, and I started something called the Popular Theatre Facilitators course that we did for 2 years. Theatre of the people, by the people, for the people, and the like. As the country changed and as it became evident that policies were going to change as well, I knew that unless we were putting something like community arts centers into the policies of the country, it was highly unlikely that many people who did not access skills in the past would again be marginalized unless we were making policies that made sure that people were able to access resources, access skills, access opportunities for them to practice their creativity. And that's how I became personally involved in policy. And so I think that for many of us within the arts, we struggle at the end of the month to pay our rent, to pay school fees if we have children, to pay for very basic things. And we don't realize that the reason why we are struggling at a micro level is because the macro policies are not conducive to supporting us. And they're not conducive to supporting us because the people making policy do not understand the arts and culture sector. So they make policies and implement policies that are not consistent with the needs of the arts and culture sector. And that's why I've been so passionate about organizations and the need to form organizations, because those are the only ways in which we as an arts and culture sector can have a voice to be able to present what it is that we want to government and then to work with government in the implementation of policy. I think the problem has been subsequently that in the absence of there being representative organizations that had sufficient membership and that had gravitas to be able to engage in government, with government, government went ahead, of course, as you know, and you know this history better than I do, in formulating SIFSA, a kind of body that they wanted to have as their representative structure within the arts and culture space, but which over the last number of years, as you know, has simply not earned the credibility that they need as an organization to be able to be the true representative of the sector and the partner of government in working on behalf of the sector. Artists have formed other organizations, I'm for the Arts, Theatre and Dance Alliance, South African Guild of Actors, ASITES. There are other organizations that artists themselves have launched to be able to represent their interest. And those are the ones that need to be further empowered to be able to represent the sector more effectively, both in formulating policy, in implementing policy, in evaluating and amending policy when necessary as well.
Pramike, I know you've got a relationship, if I can call it, with our minister, because you've been writing a lot about Minister Nathi Mthethwa. And one time he responded to your article. The reason why I was starting to ask that question from the beginning, like Abu Ben Gubani, you will think like those people that were involved in formulating the policy in the new South Africa, we understand that when the ministers are coming in, we have especially people that understand policy, they will work closer. But now it seems like our minister does not want to engage. What is your relationship with Minister Nathi Mthethwa, and what is your take regarding because he's one of the longest serving ministers. He has been serving for 7 years now. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on him.
Yeah, so in terms of the history that I kind of explained earlier, I served as the advisor to the First Minister of Arts and Culture for about 2 years or so, and then the new minister that came into being for about another 6 or 7 months. So I kind of left off after 2.5 months or 2.5 years or so to be more active in civil society again, because I really do believe that government exists for civil society, and that we need to empower civil society voices to be able to represent the sector. So what happened in the absence of there being organizations, once we dissolved things like the Arts Coalition, there was an absence of voices. So through something like the Cultural Weapon and a regular column that I had in the Mail and Guardian at the time, I took up quite critical positions with regard to government. I mean, I went from being a good boy working with government and working, alongside formulating policy, towards being probably enemy number one, because I was so critical of government and its poor implementation of policy. And for me, that wasn't about just trying to be bad boy number one. It was really about interrogating the way in which policy was being implemented. And I really felt that government was implementing policy very poorly. There were also times when, at that time, then the National Arts Coalition, people who have been appointed were doing incredibly corrupt things. So I constantly was raising things in the Mail and Guardian, and I was being fed information anonymously from people within the council to say, these are the kinds of things happening. There were people within the Department of Arts and Culture who fed me with information so that I would expose it, because people were reluctant to put these things out in the public domain themselves for fear of compromising their jobs and whatever. So I basically took on that role of being a little bit of a voice on behalf of the sector when there weren't voices for the sector in an organized form. And as a consequence, I suppose, I mean, the long and the short of it is, became very unpopular with the Department of Arts and Culture, with state institutions, with ruling party politicians. And I get that, I accept that, that's how these things work. But they also kind of go in cycles, because there are times when new people come in and then they say, look, we're recognizing in the past things have not been great, but let's try to work together. And then I would be happy to work with them, as I've done with the Arts Council subsequent to being responsible for the previous Arts Council kind of being completely fired by Minister Pada Jordan, for example, because of what I was raising in the Mail and Guardian, to working eventually with a new council to implement some of the policies that they thought were important, to again, being critical of the council and so on. So these things kind of go in phases. And with regard to this particular minister, first of all, I don't think that he should be the minister, that he should have been appointed. And so at the very beginning of his appointment, I wrote an article in the Sunday Times when I was invited to comment on his appointment. I said that after Marikana, after he's being responsible for the police who committed basically, an act of, it was a slaughter at Marikana. How can you have the politician responsible for that becoming and remaining in cabinet? If we were a true democracy, any politician responsible for something like that would need to be fired, would not need to be in a cabinet. And yet here he was, basically being appointed to be responsible for administering a ministry whose premise is freedom of expression. The miners who were engaged in basically calling for a living wage, that's what they were doing. They were exercising their right to freedom of association and freedom to expression. And yet 34 of them were slaughtered by the police. So how can you have a minister responsible for that? So from the very start, my take was that he should not have been appointed. And that was what I'd articulated from the very start. I've never met him. I don't particularly want to meet him. Probably as a person, as an individual, he's a nice guy or whatever. I don't particularly care about that. The problem is that he occupies a political position within our society. He occupies a very influential position within arts and culture as well. And so when I wrote that article in the Mail and Guardian, in the Daily Maverick, it was in response to the finance minister a couple of years ago, basically proposing this idea that we need to have a national theater and we need to have a national ballet company. And basically my article was, about what a silly idea. Why are we going to have to need a national whatever when already we have 5 funded theaters, 3 or 4 of them are in crisis. We have a department that is unable to manage the 26 structures that are in their ambit at the moment. So why add another 2 to what it is that they need to manage when in fact they don't have the capacity to do so? And rather than dealing with the arguments that I was presenting, the minister, of course, as you know, went on this ad hominem attack, basically saying that the reason why I was raising these kinds of issues was because I was no longer an advisor to the minister, because there were other people that he was calling upon to assist him. To be quite frank, I don't particularly care. Being an advisor to the minister is the last thing I want to do or to be. But this is the way in which people who occupy powerful positions operate. They believe that other people operate with the same kind of motivations that they do, that they are all driven by money, they're all driven by position, they're all driven by wanting to have influence. I don't particularly care. And that's why I personally claim the right to say what it is that I want, to raise the issues in the way that I do, because position doesn't matter to me. Whether I'm appointed or not doesn't actually matter to me. For me, it is far more important that the arts and culture sector is sustainable, is recognizing the incredible talent that we have in this country, and is creating the policy and funding conditions in which that talent is nurtured, matured, and celebrated. How difficult is that? So I see my role much more as being on the outside, as being part of civil society, helping to bring people to an understanding of how the sector operates, making sure that there are people in leadership positions to be able to take these things forward. So yeah, I mean, I'm looking forward, to be quite honest with you. I think this minister has long overstayed his welcome. He should have been fired ages ago. And I see, and people have said, if they replace him with someone else, it might be someone just as bad. That may very well be the case. But any new minister that is appointed, we will have at least a 3 to 6 month window of opportunity in which we will be able to engage with him or her to present our perspectives. So at least there will be an opportunity to present an alternative vision to what currently exists, because after 7 or 8 years, this minister has shown that he has no capacity, no desire, no political will really to engage with the sector other than through institutions and ministerial advisory teams or SIFSs that he himself appoints, that he feels comfortable with. If he was really serious about engaging with the sector, then he would look to those organizations where artists have elected their own leadership to engage with and to be open to what it is that they're basically being critical about and what they are proposing.
Yeah, it's very clear, Pramike. And I know, Pramike, you're involved in STAND and also TAGA. And it's been amazing, like over the couple of months and years to see these new structures that are coming up. But I was having a conversation with some young artists. They were saying sometimes these organizations are confusing. They don't know what is the difference.
Sure.
Like, for example, what is the difference between STAND? What is the difference STAND and TAGA? Can you unpack? And then I just want us to talk about these different structures that are out there. We understand.
Sure. So Thami, I understand that there's confusion because a lot of us involved in one is also involved in the other. So where STAND came about, and we celebrate our first anniversary on the 1st of September. So we've been around for about 11 months so far. And where it came from was last year, so I work as a playwright as well. You didn't say that in your introduction, and I want to have this known that I'm also a playwright. I'm just teasing. But anyway, so there were these companies who were doing plays of mine. There were about 3 different companies who were doing plays of mine, Return of the Ancestors and so on, and some other sons. And with COVID, basically stopping all of those activities, many of these young people who wanted to generate some income from these plays basically had no income. And of course, as you know, the theaters were kind of shut, hard lockdown, and the like. And so I said to the companies, although they were my plays, they weren't my productions, I wasn't financially responsible for them. But I said to the actors and the director and crew, look, I will raise money from my database that I've developed over a couple of decades. People have come to see my plays in the past who support my work, and I will raise money so that when they, as actors or directors or crew, because they were no longer having productions from which to earn money, if they needed money, they could come and basically ask for money. And I was able to raise quite a bit of money that way, so that when people needed to pay their rent, when they needed data, when they needed literally food, they could come and I would then be able to give them some money towards that. And then I thought, I thought that this was going to last maybe for about 3 or 4 months till the end of August, and then that would be fine, we'd be back to normal. But of course, as we know, it's now gone on for 20 months. So on the basis of that experience, though, I then said to a couple of colleagues in the dance and theater sector, people like Ismail, like Yvette, like Gregory Makoma, and so on, why don't we do the same thing, but for our whole sector? So we raise money from independent sources, and instead of simply being like an artist relief agency where we simply give money for people who needed it, like I had done with the people who are part of my play productions, let's actually try to provide interesting ways for people to do work as creatives and so earn an income, because in that way, you're still giving people money, but you're also affirming their dignity and affirming their creativity through the projects that you're doing. And out of that, Stand was born. And so Stand Foundation is literally a private foundation comprising at the moment just 8 of us, who are individuals from within the sector who have come together to say, how can we use our networks, both local networks, international networks, and our experience to be able to raise money and initiate a bunch of projects in the sector that inspire people in dance and theater and provide some form of income. It's not going to be anywhere near what we need for the whole sector, but at least for some people, we can do things to provide income and a platform for their work. So that's Stand. And how we went about raising money was we went to other people in the sector who've kind of made it, stand-up comedians or producers and people on the committee as well, and said, to become a patron of Stand, you need to give us 10,000 Rand. And we were then able to use that money to leverage money from Business and Arts South Africa, from the Netherlands Embassy. And so we had money to engage in a range of projects, which is kind of what we've done as Stand. But we're also very clear, Thami, that Stand is not a representative structure. Although it has some quite high-profile people in it in terms of the dance and theater sector, we said, look, we can't be the voice of the sector. We don't want to be, because that's a completely different animal compared to a private foundation that initiates projects in the way that I've just described. So we said there is a need for a representative organization in dance and theater that has members that can elect their members, because in Stand, we don't elect. There's just 8 of us. We decide who's going to be board members. And in fact, I invited you to be one at the very beginning, but you didn't answer me. But anyway, that's besides the point. We'll continue. So Theatre Dance Alliance is almost like going back to the old National Arts Coalition kind of structure that I spoke about at the beginning in the late 80s, early 90s that we formed, where we brought people together as individuals and organizations to say, we need to have a representative voice. And it needs to be a democratic structure where people who belong to it, they elect their own leaders. And it needs to be a non-partisan structure, not political structure, because it is political. We're engaged in politics, but we're a non-partisan structure. We're not going to align with any political party. We'll work with all parties, we'll serve our interests, but we won't be aligned with any one of them. And so it was in that context that we as Stand then took the initiative to launch the Theatre and Dance Alliance. So we said, look, let's facilitate a dance, theatre and dance alliance, and then let's withdraw. And so that's what we did. So from the middle of February till Tada was launched at the end of March, I basically played the driving role, secretariat role, and the like. And then the membership, out of that, a new steering committee emerged. I no longer am the secretary. I'm just one of the members of the steering committee. There's a different chairperson, different deputy chairperson, different secretariat, and I contribute. And we stand as a member of TADA, we make a contribution, but it's really the collective representing different parts of the dance and theatre sector who now give direction to stand. And obviously, to TADA, and obviously there are many people in stand who have experience and so on, so we make a contribution to projects that TADA might have, like the PESP funding thing, we do some of the research or some of the artist charter thing, but all the time, trying to encourage and identify new leadership to take over. So for example, one of the things that we as Stand has done, we initiated a leadership training program, a year-long program, weekly webinars to do with cultural policy and the like. And out of this, new people kind of emerging to become what we believe should be the new leaders, so that those of us who've been around can step back and no longer be in these positions. We don't have to be, but we need to make sure that if new structures emerge, that there are the leaders with the knowledge about the institutional memory of what has happened over the last while, that understand where policy comes from, that have the confidence and the capacity to be able to build these networks and sustain these networks as well. So that's really what the vision of Stand is. And so we're kind of looking, my agenda, my personal agenda is by the end of this first year of TADA and its National Steering Committee that I would step down next year when a new committee is elected, because by that time, there will be people in place with the necessary skills, networks, knowledge to be able to lead TADA, and I won't need to be there. I can concentrate a little bit more on Stand, and even then, we're going to try to find more people to take over Stand. And I'll then just become a playwright and write novels and twiddle my thumbs for a while. That's the plan.
Which brings me to the next question. Your plays, some people regard them very controversial. I was lucky enough to be in one of them, Remain Flashy, back in the days. And a lot of people have been asking, there's no way that Mr. Mike van Graan is funded by the government, because he's like bashing the government or challenging, not in a way of bashing. You understand? So for when Mike as a cultural activist that is outspoken, you understand that? Did it not affect? There were obviously, I'm sure there are bad consequences and stuff. You understand? Because we're having a lot of artists that don't want to engage in terms of policy or don't want to be seen as if they are fighting government. They are scared to speak out. But I want to know, when how was that experience and any consequences? Because some of the things that you say, some of the things that you raise in your plays are like, wow, they're going to kill Mike. So how has that experience been?
Thami, this kind of goes to the very essence of why certainly I'm engaged in the way that I am within the arts and culture sector, because our experience through the apartheid era was that we did not have freedom of expression in the way that we as artists wanted. So we had a real censorship authority, right, who could ban the works of artists. If they presented a play that was critical of the National Party government, the censorship board would go and watch the play and they would ban it. That's it. And many plays suffered from that effect. Many artists, musicians were banned from being played on SABC radio because of the lyrics of their songs that were critical. Many poets, many books were banned by the apartheid state. So when we struggle for new arts and culture policies through the process that I earlier was describing, the principle of freedom of expression was kind of fundamental to what it was that we were fighting for. Because we said in a democracy, unless you have freedom of expression guaranteed in the Constitution, you don't have democracy. And we also said another fundamental principle of democracy, in order to enshrine the principle of freedom of expression, artists needed to be able to exercise that freedom and be funded by government to exercise that freedom if we were serious about being a democracy. In other words, if government says we're a constitutional democracy, which we now are because we've got a constitution that says that, government cannot say, because you are saying bad things about me as government, I will not fund you, because that is not democracy. And that's exactly the reason why we fought for the establishment of the National Arts Council, because it would be this independent body that existed at arm's length to government. Before, the National Party used to send money directly to the performing arts councils, and they would then present plays, but they would also appoint the chairpersons of these arts councils to ensure their political hegemony within those arts councils. So, for example, at KPAD, the former Artscape, there was an occasion when their drama company put on a play called Picnic by Dingaan. It was a play mainly done by, ironically, Afrikaans actors who were employed by KPAD, and they did this play that was kind of critical of the apartheid government. And it wasn't the censorship board that banned the play, but it was the chairperson of their board of KPAB that banned the play. Those actors went and they did the play anyway at the National Arts Festival. They did it at the Baxter and they won large acclaim. But as a consequence, they fired Johan Esthuizen, who was at that time the head of drama at KPAB. And so that kind of experience taught us as activists that you need in a new dispensation to ensure, A, that you had an independent body allocating public funds, that body comprised people from within the arts and culture sector who made the decisions about who got funding and who didn't get funding based on artistic merit and not on political considerations about whether they were supportive of the government or not. The second thing that we learned was that publicly funded cultural institutions must have boards that elect their own chairpersons and not be appointed by a minister, because those chairpersons will then have political influence within those boards and they will genuflect to the minister who appointed them. And that's how it was at the beginning of our new democratic dispensation. Unfortunately, the laws were changed so that now through the Cultural Laws Amendment Act, the minister does have the right to appoint the chairpersons of every publicly funded cultural institution, which is completely wrong. And that's what has led to some of these institutions trying to get rid of their management when management has, either blocked their ability to access the public purse, or they've done things that are politically not consistent with what the chairpersons or the ruling party want those managements to do. So this is a context, again, in which I'm painting my work as a playwright, because I really do believe that as artists, we often almost claim the right to be the prophets in our society. And we talk about, it is our role to be at the coalface and the cutting edge of freedom of expression. And yet, as you point out, so many of us are too scared to express what we are really thinking, to say what we're really thinking, for fear of not accessing public funds, for fear of being marginalized by the politicians of the day, for fear of being marginalized even by our own colleagues, because they fear that by associating with us, they are somehow going to, not be called upon to go on overseas trips or to access public funding and the like. One of the plays I'm writing now, Thami, is about a whistleblower. And I've been reading these books written by whistleblowers, people who have, blown the whistle on corruption and the incredible consequences that they face. They are people who have lost their jobs, people who have had emotional and psychological trauma as a consequence. But you know what else? People have been assassinated. And these are people within the ruling party who have been assassinated by other people in the ruling party. So I'm not naive about what it is that one does as an artist, as a playwright, in raising these issues through a green man flashing or through a Payback the Curry or Land Axe, all plays that obviously take critical perspectives on what is happening within our society now. But this is the thing, Thami, that if we as artists and as civil society and as citizens retreat from the public space in which there is contestation around ideas and so on, then we give over that space to others who create democracy in their self-serving image. We as artists, if we don't occupy the space and challenge and push back and raise issues that are critical of what is happening in our society, we don't allow our audiences a degree of catharsis, because our audiences are intimidated. They don't want to say things lest they be called racist or anti-transformation or whatever. We have a responsibility in a society that is in transition to call out our politicians, to be the prophetic voices, to speak on behalf of those who do not necessarily have the resources or the language or the confidence to say what it is that they believe. We cannot be in a society, Thami, sorry, I'm preaching here, but 55% of our population, 55% of our population lives below the poverty line. They don't go to the theater because they don't have resources. 40% of our people are unemployed. They are not going to be your first audiences to pay money to come and see your plays. 10%, 15% of us in our society, and I include myself in that, we earn 70% of the national income. 40% of those who have income have to make do with 6 to 7% of national income. The inequality in our country is astronomical. We are the most unequal society in the world. The level of gender-based violence in our country. I mean, again, one of the most patriarchal and societies in which the abuse of women and the abuse of LGBTI communities is just, it's unspeakable. How can we be silent as artists? If we are silent, we are complicit. We are complicit. And so, Thami, for me, it's just the same consistency as in the same way as one was active as a playwright within the apartheid era, calling out the apartheid government and organizing artists to claim their rights within that era. So it is necessary for us to be calling out those in power now and organizing our sector to be able to have a voice that articulates the interests and defends the interests of the arts and culture sector, and to be able to play a role that serves our society rather than serves any political party.
Mike, in the beginning, you spoke about the National Arts Council Act that was also developed like around 1990 something, 6 or 8. And there are so many wrong things that are happening currently at the NAC. As someone that was there in drafting the act and advising, you understand, what do you think needs to be done with the status of the National Arts Council? I'm sure you saw, like, for example, when you engage with them, was asking a simple question on the website. They're supposed to write all the council names and biography.
Yeah.
And for every CEO to say that information is not there, it's really scary. But what is your take in terms of the status of the National Arts Council, and what do you think needs to be done?
Yeah, so, in terms of the vision for the National Arts Council, of it being this independent body that served the arts, and that would be this buffer between the politicians and government and the arts, I think from quite early on in its formation, it was compromised. And so it saw itself, because it was kind of the major player in terms of its funding was government, so that there have been very few Arts Council members and chairpersons who have challenged government, who have stood up to government. Again, because councils are appointed by government, and more particularly now recently, since 2000, their chairpersons are appointed by the minister. Those arts councils are much more aligned to the minister and the Department of Arts and Culture than they are to the arts and culture sector whom they are supposed to serve. So, you know, from quite early on, the Arts Council lost its capacity for engaging with the broader kind of civil society and for meeting with civil society and saying, how can we serve your interests? It also became, and unfortunately, this is the case with these arts councils, that they became conduits for individuals who serve on the council to access public funding, if not for themselves, then for their organizations, which we believe to be wrong. And so people have tended to use their positions in publicly funded institutions much more for their own benefit than for the benefit of the institution and its role within society and for the broader arts and culture sector. And I think that that's true of not just this Arts Council, but previous arts councils as well. And unfortunately, it's a reflection of our society, where so many people who have gone into government, who've gone into any level of government, any state-funded institution, any state-owned enterprise, their primary objective appears to have been, how do I enrich myself? How do I get money out of this for me and what it is that I do, than to serve what it is that that institution was set up to do. And I think that that's kind of been a very unfortunate thing. And so my belief is that, first of all, this particular council, I have a degree of sympathy for them in that they were appointed in the middle of the PESP crisis. And that's a reflection of the minister. That, again, I think is another reason why this minister should go. It was such a stupid thing to do. He could have extended the tenure of the previous board to the end of March of this year to allow that whole PESP thing to happen, and then the new council taking place from the 1st of April. But he placed them in an incredibly compromising position to have to deal with the fallout of the previous board's decision before they had even been inducted. And so many of them were accused of having conflicts of interest, because although the previous council had determined that some of them were beneficiaries, they were now in a position of having to administer that. And so there were real and perceived conflicts of interest, all really as a result of a really stupid decision by the Minister of Arts and Culture. But that having happened, and the arrogant ways in which this council has dealt with things and the lack of transparency and so on, I really think that this council, it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, for them to gain real credibility within the sector again. So I think that what needs to happen, really, in terms of moving forward, there needs to be a new minister appointed, a new deputy minister. There needs to be new management at a senior level in DSAC being appointed. And there needs to be, once those new members of DSAC and a new minister are appointed, there needs to be a new council as well. This council, for me, they should be fired, an administrator put in place, and allowed for a period in which the debacle of the PSP funding is kind of resolved, audits are happening and so on, so that when a new council comes into being, they don't inherit, what is a poisoned chalice, but they are able to start afresh, and that council and the new minister and the new leadership of the DSAC meets with the leadership of organizations that have emerged over the last 20 months. And there are many. We've never been so organized post 1994 as we are now. And that there be, again, a meeting of these players so that a new policy can emerge, a new way of cooperating together kind of emerges for the benefit of arts and culture and practitioners in our country.
Mike, I wanted to have like an hour with you. This was really, really, really helpful. But my last question, I remember you invited me to a debate some years ago with the question that we needed to ask. Today, I want to ask you, must artists align themselves with political parties?
Is that because you're aligned with a political party, Thami? Look, so at a personal level, obviously, I think that all artists should vote. I think that every person who's a citizen of this country should be politically aware. And when it comes to voting for a party that they believe serves their particular interest, they need to engage and they need to vote for that party that they believe does so. Secondly, I also believe that artists need to not be politically naive, but need to accept that political parties have influence over their lives through policy and through funding and the like. And so artists need to engage with political parties and help to shape their arts and culture policies. When it comes to organizations that represent artists, because those organizations represent artists who have various political persuasions, I don't believe that artist organizations should be aligned with any one political party. I think that arts organizations need to represent their members rather than represent a political party to their membership. And I think that that's one of the failings of unions in the past, COSATU-aligned unions, that their priority has been to represent the ANC and its interests to its members in the belief that by doing so, the ANC will look after the interests of its members. And it's moot as to whether that has happened. And so I think artist organizations have to be non-partisan. They need to be independent of any political party, but they need to engage as many political parties as they believe necessary in the interest of their members. So their guiding point is what is in the best interests of our members and what is the most effective ways of pursuing and defending and maintaining the interest of our members. Which parties do we need to engage with? Who has influence? You know, do we engage with this one? Do we engage with that one? At a national level, at a provincial level, at a local level? Because there are different parties that basically run things at different levels of government. So we need to be strategic in the way that we approach things. We need to be politically non-partisan, and yet we need to be incredibly political in the sense that we understand that we operate within very real socioeconomic political conditions. And we need to be able to know how to engage with those conditions while we are pursuing the interest of our members.
Mike, your closing remark, do you feel there is still hope, there is some positivity out there in terms of our industry on your side? And then you can give us any closing remarks.
Yeah, you know, you're asking this at a very difficult time, because COVID-19 has just devastated our sector. And I think that, you know, particularly those of us involved in the performing arts and dance and theater in particular, it's kind of been particularly heavy on the theater and dance sector because there are other forms that can be sold and distributed through, I suppose, digital means like music and literature and even visual arts and the like. Much more of a challenge to present plays with great production values through online platforms. So it's really affected our sector, and it's asked quite fundamental questions of theater, for example, in terms of its existential form. You know, before, when we used to feel threatened by other things taking away audiences like radio or television or Netflix, it's because there's been a competition between theater and these other things that people can spend more time looking at in their free time. Whereas what COVID-19 has done, it's basically attacked the economics of theater by closing theaters, by having curfews, so that theaters are unable to have extended times when they are open, to have the bar open, to generate money through the bar to subsidize theater. Audiences have been curtailed. 50 people can go to the theater at the moment, which is ridiculous. Even in a 1,300-seater, we can only have 50 people because of some stupid person's reasoning. So it's affected the economics of theater, but also it's affected our understanding of theater in terms of historically, as you know, Thami, when we went to university, we were taught that theater is the live encounter between performers and audience. And no performance is ever the same because every audience is different and every live encounter is different. So when we now put things onto a digital platform, there is no audience. There is no interaction between those who are performing and a live encounter. So the very existential nature of theater is being questioned through COVID as well. And then, you know, the very existential nature of theater has been threatened by the number of people in our sector who have died, who are dying as a consequence of COVID, but also the number of people who are completely disillusioned because there is no work within our sector, and government has shown just how marginalized our sector is by not coming out in support of it and not understanding that our sector can maybe have some form of income if they allowed theaters and spaces to be opened up a little bit more with nuance as opposed to this blanket ruling of only 50 people. So many people within the sector are thinking of leaving the sector or have left the sector to go to other areas of work to generate some kind of income. So, you know, you're asking this question about optimism at a very critical time. And to be quite honest with you, I think that on the one hand, I'm quite pessimistic because those who make decisions about our lives don't understand the nature of what it is that we do. On the other hand, I'm optimistic because there are so many organizations that have come into being, and I'm hoping that through us working together, things like the Artist Charter, through things like the Artist Summit, by people coming together, we'll be able to have a voice again that will be one that can ensure that the arts are taken more seriously, that policy and funding are becoming a bit more aligned with what needs to happen to nurture and grow and celebrate the talent that we have. So in a way, my final thing is something which I came across when I did honors in drama at UCT was a quote from Brecht, which he took from Antonio Gramsci. And that's a paradox which I think we dwell in: the pessimism of the intellect and the optimism of the will. And that's the paradox for us as citizens, as artists. With our intellects, we're able to understand and analyze and see that, wow, things are really bad. So as a consequence, we're quite pessimistic about the future, about the now. But the fact that we are alive and that we are constantly struggling to make things better through organization, through raising funds, through teaching and imparting skills and knowledge, those are acts of optimism. And so, you know, that's the paradox that we dwell within: intellectual pessimism, and with our hearts, we are optimistic and we live and we continue to try to make a difference. And that's some days we are more pessimistic than other days. Some days we're more optimistic than other days. But yeah, at the moment, that's kind of the paradox in which we dwell. I'm kind of hoping that in the not too distant future, once there's a degree of herd immunity, when many people are vaccinated, that we'll be able to restart the theater again, possibly not in the way that we've known it in the past, but at least to begin to go in a direction where things will begin to open up again.
Yo, Mike, as Uliseho kept saying in the YouTube that the background info is so valuable, Mike. How can we be quiet as artists? If we're quiet, we are complacent. And we have Van Rensberg saying, let's make some noise. So thank you, Mike, for this valuable information. You understand? Because we are doing this talk so that other people can know. They understand where we are coming from and where we are going. You understand? So it was very useful. And you know, I've been wanting to have this one-on-one. Maybe we'll do another one on a round table, but we will keep in touch. Thank you very much, Mike, on our side.
Thami, thank you very much for invitation and for doing this. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for everyone